Hello, Kitten. You better watch out. Your brother's on strike right now. Don't be a scab. Say hello to you too. Why, hello there, endurance nerds. We meet here yet again. This time sans ridiculous t-shirt, but I did wear one during this workout. I swear I have receipts. I highly recommend wearing ridiculous t-shirts during your workouts because placebo-controlled peer-reviewed research has indicated that wearing a ridiculous t-shirt during your indoor trainer rides can improve your FTP by upwards of 30 watts. I'd prefer that you didn't fact-check that data point and just trust me implicitly. This is YouTube science after all. But let's talk about the workout. A workout for which the naming convention has not left a lot to the imagination, as we're doing the steady state. Can't possibly imagine what we're working on today. Perhaps the steady state. We'll find out. But this workout's an interesting one, as it's a bit of an outlier in this year's Academy. With the other workouts, we're either assessing or working pretty high executions of power, looking at our threshold and above, into our VO2 max and our anaerobic power. In this one, we are working well beneath those prior workouts. However, that does not mean that this workout won't be exceptionally difficult. While from a load and intensity perspective, this is not the most difficult one of the bunch, I actually expect the adherence on this workout to be exceptionally low. I actually expect the majority of people to really struggle with executing this workout, and we'll talk about why as we go through the video. In fact, for the majority of you watching this, I would actually recommend choosing the shorter workout. Even if you have the time available to do the longer workout, you may not yet be capable of doing these types of sustained efforts. For those of you who are triathletes, time trialists, this type of work is going to be your bread and butter, and you'll probably very much excel at this type of workout. But I think for the majority of riders out there who might do those endurance miles, or who may do a lot of high intensity where they're going out for races or high intensity interval training, this is going to be a bit of a struggle. You may not have the muscular endurance or practice in the legs to be able to get through this workout. So we'll talk through the structure real quick here because they're very straightforward workouts, and then we'll kind of talk about what people may struggle with and what you're going to be able to expect to evaluate through these workouts. So the structure is going to be pretty straightforward for both the long and the short workout. You're going to have a workout bookended by an ascending and a descending warm-up and cool-down respectively. And then in the middle, you're going to have two primary sets. One is kind of like an activation, or we can call it a priming set, and then one of them is going to be your test set. In contrast to the other workouts where you're going to do an open power-driven test, you're actually going to be testing for something different here. And the instruction is that you are to hold as close to the same power for the first set as you did for the test set. So the very first activation set you will have is going to be at 90% of your FTP, and for the long workout, it's going to be 30 minutes. For the short workout, it will be 10 minutes. So already, your activation set at 30 minutes for the long workout at 90% of your FTP, many of you will not be capable of that today. We'll talk about that more here shortly. For the longer workout, you are going to have a second 30-minute free ride set this time, and for the shorter workout, you will have that for 20 minutes. So even for the short workout, you're going to be doing 90% of your FTP for a pretty long time. Now, don't be fooled by the green here, right? Green looks achievable. It looks like your go-all-day zone. And when you're trained to that effect, it certainly is. But sweet spot is still a pretty high level of power. You're approaching that zone 4 or that threshold range. So while you're still technically in zone 3 and you're not necessarily building up as much lactate, this is still going to be a pretty heavy lift. Now, for those of you who are experienced in either triathlon, time trialing, or you just like to do sustained efforts and you're very well practiced, you could push yourself a little bit. You could look to try to get closer to your FTP for those open sets, but that's not really the intended purpose of this workout, and I'll talk through that here. What you're looking to test in that free ride session is a few different things. Number one is your capability to just sustain that power, right? Can you sustain 90% of your FTP with a little bit of fatigue built into the system from the first set, and can you hold that for the full 20 or 30 minutes? And what this is going to be contingent on is your muscular endurance. And I've talked about this concept a little bit in previous videos, including during this series, with respect to your functional threshold power. Many people these days are doing your functional threshold power test in terms of a ramp test, right? It's doing a few things. It's a little more time efficient. You're able to do the test without baking in too much fatigue for your later training, and you can test more often if needed. However, what it's not telling you is whether or not you have the muscular endurance to hold that power, right? It's trying to proxy for your lactate threshold, so your capability to clear lactate as it's being produced at a high level of power, but what it's not testing is, have you trained enough to now sustain that FTP for a longer period of time? Sweet spot is no different. Because it's just under your FTP or your threshold, it's still going to require a great deal of muscular endurance to hold that power for a longer period of time. If you don't specifically train muscular endurance and you're doing a lot more maybe stochastic high intensity effort that you will see in something like a race or a high intensity interval session, you're not necessarily training your muscular endurance. It's a practice skill. There's no way to gain muscular endurance without just practicing holding high tension for a longer period of time. You can do that with tempo efforts, you can do that with sweet spot efforts, you can do that with threshold threshold efforts. Usually sweet spot is a good zone to do that type of practice because it's not quite at your threshold, so it's not building the fatigue, but it's getting you very close to the same amount of benefits. So you can get used to holding high levels of power for a longer period of time. Even those of you who do some work in sweet spot, especially users of Trainer Road, because there's a lot of solid sweet spot workouts there, depending on how far you've pushed the length of those intervals, you may or may not be ready for this type of effort of 20 or 30 minutes sustained at 90% of your FTP. And it goes back to something I mentioned a couple videos back in terms of people being able to kind of unwittingly cheat their way through efforts by using those type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers. They can put out a high amount of power because they have a decent amount of strength in their legs, but those are in those not particularly fatigue resistant muscle fibers. So if you're used to doing 8, 10, 12-minute intervals, you might be used to muscling your way through and kind of cheating your way, I use that term loosely, through those particular intervals. But when you have a workout like this, where you're going to have to sustain that power over 20, 30 minutes, that's going to expose that weakness. You're not necessarily going to be able to rely on your type 2 muscle fibers that long. So you're going to start to break down, and that's usually indicated by your cadence really starting to bog down. So whether you do the short or long, depending on your experience in this type of training modality, you're going to get a pretty good appraisal of where your muscular endurance lies. The second thing that you're going to be checking here is your overall endurance, your aerobic capability, and your general fatigue resistance. I've talked about cardiac drift a little bit. One of the things you're going to want to look for, especially in the second free ride section where you've already gotten a little fatigue baked in the legs, is what you should see is that your heart rate climbs for the first couple of minutes of that free ride section as you move from zone 2 recovery into your zone 3 and you settle in, that your heart rate will climb and then it should remain pretty static. If you continue to see your heart rate climb as you move through the set and as you get later in the workout, that means you're not necessarily very fatigue resistant from an aerobic standpoint, that your type 1 muscle fibers aren't prepared to take on that kind of load for an extended period of time, and that they're going to be calling on the cardiovascular system to deliver more oxygen as fuel. You have not necessarily become as adept or efficient in terms of your aerobic or endurance capacity. This is why I talk a lot about the importance of baking in those kind of long, slow base miles or those endurance miles in concert with maybe your more high intensity training or your racing. It's a very important part of any rider's repertoire is to be able to have a good base of the pyramid, an endurance base. I'll leave a video about that down below and in the end screen here. But it's critical that you're able to hold that baseline aerobic level of power without putting undue strain on your cardiovascular system. So if you start to see that cardiac drift, you know that you have some work to do from an aerobic or endurance perspective. That's okay. You've learned something here and you know precisely what you need to work on. So you may get through it from a muscular endurance standpoint because your muscles are ready to go, but you're still drawing more oxygen or more strain than need be because you're not necessarily acclimated to doing it for that period of time. And the third thing you're going to get a test on, and this one's a little bit on the softer side, is just your ability to pace, right? So the first section, you'll be able to do in erg mode if you so choose. And then the second section in free ride, now you have to hold your own power. And many people have no problem working outside of erg mode. Erg mode hasn't existed for all of that long, right? So people will have to go into those on intervals and hold the prescribed power. It's much easier to do that for shorter periods of time, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, even 10 minutes. But when you start to get to 20 or 30 minutes, hyper-focusing on the prescribed power and constantly micro-adjusting, which you might be doing at those higher executions, is a little bit more difficult if you're not particularly practiced in pacing. An experienced cyclist should be able to kind of dial in, you pick a resistance or a gear, and you can dial into a particular cadence and just kind of knock that out all day. Yes, of course you can micro-adjust, you can get out of the saddle, maybe you shift up or down to switch up your cadence a little bit, but as soon as you adjust into that new level, you should really be able to knock that out like a metronome because your workout mode will be agnostic to the terrain on the road. If you feel like you're kind of all over the place and you're always micro adjusting, and then if you're supposed to be at 250 watts, then you're at 280, then you're at 210, you know you have a little work to do in terms of your pacing. And a lot of times it won't necessarily be a concerted effort to work on pacing unless you are a time trialist. It's more something that comes with experience. You should be able to stay in a pretty tight locus around the prescribed power and understanding that instantaneous power reads or even 3-second power averaging that you can set in the back end of Zwift, depending on how well you want your power to be smooth. You're going to bounce around a little bit, but you should be within plus or minus 15 watts, give or take. So if you're 250 watts, you should be able to hold power between 235 and 265 watts, but really being as close as possible to that 250 for the entire 20 or 30 minute interval. Now, depending on your priorities as a rider, those 3 different elements may carry different weights for each of you. In terms of muscular endurance, it's an important part of cycling. It's going to be more critical for those people who have to hold steady state power. For somebody who's doing more racing, especially crit racing, cyclocross, something that's very punchy, it's probably less important. It's helpful, but it's not necessarily something that you have to rely on, being able to have the muscular endurance to hold 90% of your FTP straight for 30 minutes. So if that's one of your weaknesses, it's something that you can work on, but it might not be a priority in your training plan. The second piece, when it comes to looking at your cardiac drift, looking at your aerobic capability and your endurance in general, this is very critical for all athletes. And for those folks, even those who train high volume, usually takes maybe 1 to 3 years to really settle in and have a good solid base of aerobic endurance. That's not to say that you can't be a solid rider with a good aerobic base in year 1 and year 2, but you really start to come in your own after you have a certain number of miles in the legs, and that very often happens around year 3 for a lot of riders. But please do not dismiss this point, because even if your target events are not 2, 3, 4 hour long rides, what happens is when you continue to draw on those type 2 muscle fibers, when you're doing those high anaerobic efforts or those VO2 max efforts in a race, and you still have more to go and you have to settle into the bunch, the more you do that, the more you tax those type 2 muscle fibers, you need something to fall back on. And if that aerobic system and those type 1 muscle fibers have not been developed and they're not fatigue resistant, you're just going to completely fall apart because you have no other muscles to call on when those type 2 muscle fibers start to fatigue or fail, whether it's acutely in the moment or chronically as you've gotten later and later into the event or race. And number 3, in terms of pacing, again, it's a good skill to have. It makes you a more well-rounded cyclist, and it's something that often comes with experience. In fact, if you spend enough years on the bike, a lot of times you can guess within 10 to 15 watts how much power you're putting on the pedals, completely blind, because you just get used to how it feels. Is it necessary to have that skill? Absolutely not. But it's just something that comes with experience, and it could be helpful. If you are a time trialist or a triathlete, that's something that you need to dial in. So a lot of your training is going to come to specificity. There's no one size fits all. The results that you get from this workout are going to have varying degrees of importance depending on what type of rider you are and the expected demands of your objectives or your events. I've talked about cadence in several workouts of this series. It's going to be important here, but there's not going to be much that you can do to control it. So we talked about type 2 muscle fiber utilization and not wanting to burn them up prematurely, right? If you're working at 90% of your FTP and you're grinding away and you're really chewing up those type 2 muscle fibers early, you're probably going to fall apart earlier. But at the same time, for these longer efforts of 20 to 30 minutes for the free ride sections, you're going to want to ride what's comfortable for you. You're not going to be able to sustain, unless it's practiced, a higher cadence than you're used to. If you are a grinder and you're used to 70 to 75 RPM, you're not going to hold 90 RPM for 20 to 30 minutes in order to spare your type 2 muscle fibers. You're going to have to just see where you are. If you're between 70 and 85 RPM, which might be on the lower end of the spectrum, you're probably going to be okay, especially if you're used to it and you've built the muscular endurance to support those low cadences. In fact, a lot of folks that are in the triathlon world do ride those lower cadences for extended periods of time because it has a sparing effect on the cardiovascular system so that they're ready for the run. Anything under 70 RPM, I do think you're going to prematurely fatigue here. There are going to be outliers. There's going to be individuals that really excel at those exceptionally low cadences, but usually, for most people, population averages, looking at these 20 to 30 minute efforts at 60 to 70 RPM, I don't know that most people are going to make it through those efforts unless it's something that they've trained for a very long time. So just bear the cadence in mind and see where you are. Look at what your averages are in terms of the activation effort as well as the free ride set, and you'll be able to get some insights as to where you are in terms of your development there. Lastly, nutrition on this one. I'm going to call this one pretty similarly to workout number 4, where going into it with your glycogen stores topped up either the night before a morning workout or having something to eat during the day and going into this workout. Do you need to fuel during? No, you could get through this. This could be a good indication of your metabolic efficiency or flexibility and see if you're really starting to run on fumes or if you can get through this workout pretty strong. But there is going to be a relatively high burn rate on this. Again, 90% of your FTP, depending on your raw power, you can have a very high caloric burn and you can burn through those sugars pretty quickly. So I think the optimal approach is to come in fueled and maybe have a modest amount of fuel on board. Maybe 60 grams for the entirety of the workout, 90 if you want them, so that's usually 2 to 3 gels for those people who take in a gel, and that will just help you to feel energetic throughout the course of the ride. And then post-fueling, just from a recovery standpoint, it's definitely important. Depending on your experience, you can go a number of different ways, but if you're uncertain or you just want to hit this workout strong, come in fueled, glycogen stores topped up, and then fuel modestly, maybe around 60 grams of carbs for the entirety of the longer workout. Now I do want to zoom into nutrition a little bit more here, because every time I make a comment about nutrition, and it's a very polarizing topic, I do get one or two folks in these videos that pushes back, and it's often respectfully, and that's fine. I'm all for respectful disagreement. But what I've noticed is oftentimes when I get those comments that don't necessarily agree, or they talk about their personal experience, sometimes it comes from a place of restriction. And endurance athletes in general tend to have some disordered perceptions or thought about eating. Whether it rises to the level of something clinical, I'm not going to get into that here, but endurance athletes in general are very much preoccupied with the power to weight ratio, and understandably so. It's an important metric when it comes to cycling, but oftentimes they get it wrong. Many people go into endurance sport to help to drop unwanted weight anyway, and those people who compete always want to manage that balance. What's the most amount of power I can have for the least amount of weight? And the low-hanging fruit that they're looking at is calories, right? The calories in, calories out. How do I manage my energy balance so that I have a caloric deficit so that I can continue to lose body mass? Typically body fat, right? Wanting to lose that non-productive adipose tissue first. So when they think about fueling during workouts, well, these are basically empty calories. I'm basically eating no nutritional value, sugar-laden foods. What a waste of calories. If I want to run a caloric deficit, why on earth would I waste my calorie budget on shitty foods like gels, goos, drink mixes, and so on and so forth? And while intellectually I can follow that logic, it doesn't make sense from a general training perspective, and it really doesn't make sense from a weight loss perspective either. Now, we've already talked quite a bit through these videos and other videos I've made about the performance element when it comes to taking on sugars during your ride. When you are working at a higher intensity, basically your zone 3 and above, you are using glucose as a primary source of fuel. You're not using as much fat anymore. You're using some fat, and don't confuse fat with the fat on your body. We're talking about substrate utilization, but you are primarily using sugar to fuel your muscles. You can depend on the glycogen stores, but they're not as readily available. So if you want to optimize your power, you would give the muscles sugar that it can just grab out of the bloodstream very quickly and execute. So if you're looking to improve as an athlete and improve your power to weight ratio, part of that equation is power. If you're not feeding the muscles to put the power out, you're not improving, so you're not really improving that ratio anyway. Even if you're dropping raw body mass, you may not be providing the muscles with enough energy to hold that power constant, and you may see that power drop in lockstep. The other side of the same coin comes by way of recovery. If you're not feeding the muscles with the fuel that it needs to maintain and repair the muscles to supercompensate from the work, again, you're not going to see that improvement in power or even maintenance in power in some cases, depending on how drastic your caloric deficit may be. And if that's not compelling enough for you, let's talk about the calorie equation. If you fuel the work, if you are making sure that you are going into your workouts fueled, and or you are taking in sugars during your ride, you will be able to execute more power. When you execute more power, you burn, you guessed it, more calories. Calories are not calculated on your heart rate. Calories are an energy expenditure measurement. Energy comes by way of output, by watts, right? More watts, more calories. If you're under fueling yourself and you're putting out less watts, you're burning fewer calories. If you're fueling the work and you're feeling strong and energized and you can push for those extra watts, you will burn more calories, which is going to further enhance your deficit or give you a greater caloric budget so that you can eat your later meals, snacks, whatever it is you choose. But dieting on the bike is not going to be helping you. It's going to further enhance catabolism. You're going to lose the lean body mass that you don't want to lose, as opposed to the adipose tissue that you may be looking at. I'm not going to get too deep into this here, but so many people try to go overboard when it comes to a caloric deficit. Endurance sports is not the way that you're going to be able to do that. If you think you're going to run 1,000 calorie deficit and still perform, you're deluding yourself. Period. Even folks that are trying to do that in the bodybuilding world when they're trying to cut for a show, they're putting a tremendous tax on their body. But those folks can barely walk around the block. If you think you're going to perform, least of which at your peak when it comes to endurance sport, which is very heavy in terms of cardiovascular ability and energy consumption, you're just setting yourself up for disaster. You're not going to last a week before you either rebound, being so ravenous that ghrelin just takes over and you're going to eat the entire fridge, or your performance is just going to fall off a cliff. So if your weight goes down and your power goes down, what have you gained? It's definitely a delicate balance when it comes to nutrition and endurance sport. Many people look to the pros, especially in the peak portion of their season, that are carrying a very lean physique, a physique, by the way, that 99% of them do not carry throughout the course of the year, and you don't necessarily see them in the off season. I'm not saying that they gain 50 pounds, but they are not necessarily as hyper lean as they are during their peak races or their peak season. But you're trying to hold a body composition or body mass that is usually below your genetic set point. And oftentimes people come up with with an arbitrary idea, whether it's a number on the scale or a number for fat-free body mass or a body fat percentage that they think will optimize them as a rider. What you'll hear even a lot of pros talk about, when they stopped looking at some arbitrary number and they worked with the nutritionist and they worked with a coach and they realized that carrying an extra 5 pounds of good, lean, muscular body tissue, they were actually able to increase their power tremendously. So their power to weight ratio went up, their speed went up, their FTP went up, but they're heavier than they were when they were trying to constantly starve themselves to hold some arbitrary weight that they think is the proper one for their sport of choice, whether it's cycling, triathlon, running, what have you. So I don't want to preach too much when it comes to nutrition. I probably spent more time than I should on this conversation as it is, but I know a lot of you folks come to these videos because you're new to indoor training, maybe you're new to training in general, you're new to Zwift, maybe you're joining Zwift Academy to see what the structured work thing is all about. And before you get too far into the death spiral of body weight management or body composition management and get into a disordered way of thinking that is very prevalent in endurance sport, just take a step back, think about what you're doing, fuel the work, understand that even if you're carrying excess body weight, you didn't gain it in 3 days, you're not going to lose it in 3 days. So take your time, it's more sustainable. If you run a very modest caloric deficit, that way you make sure that you're losing the right kind of body tissue, the stuff that's not serving you. You hang on to your lean body tissue, especially for those who are getting older, and that you're optimizing for your power, not just your weight. But I'm gonna shut up about that now. That's it for this workout. It's pretty straightforward. It's gonna be tough for a lot of you folks that don't have practice in this particular realm. I recommend for most of you, unless you have a high level of confidence that you can hold that level of power, just pick up the short workout, maybe do an endurance extension for your warm-up or for your cool down, or both if you so choose, if you need to spend a little bit more time on the bike. I hope you guys enjoy this session. Let me know how you do in the comments down below. Any questions or concerns down there as well. Hit all the YouTube buttons right there down below, not too far. You shouldn't strain much, maybe your index finger. And as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.